Hello. So in this video, we're going to go over a lesson plan for teaching students to find assumptions in written arguments. So basically, assumptions, short version, these are things, principles, ideas that readers need to accept or believe in order for an argument to be persuasive. Typically, assumptions work at the level of connecting the support that's given, the evidence that's given to the claim that's being made or the conclusion that's being drawn. Here's why this argument is true. That's typically what assumptions deal with. But basically, again, these are things that either the audience already needs to believe them, or you need to convince the audience to believe them. There are two different broad categories of assumptions, implicit and explicit, and the activity, I wouldn't say it's a full lesson plan because it would be hard to draw this out over a 50-minute class, let alone a 75-minute class. I did this as one exercise along with a whole bunch of other exercises on a particular day. But the exercise really centers around finding implicit assumptions. So that's assumptions that aren't directly stated, but that you would need to accept in order for the argument to follow. So I started by teaching a brief lesson about assumptions. I'd had my students do a reading on assumptions, in this case out of this textbook, The Structure of Argument, by Annette Rottenberg and Donna Winchell. But you can find any reading on assumptions in rhetoric, it would work just as well. So I started by having them define what assumptions are, and I wrote their elements up on the board after each person who raised their hand gave their definition. I asked if there was anything else that we wanted to add, and so in this way we sort of collectively built up a fairly comprehensive definition. Then I talked about the differences between implicit and explicit assumptions, that implicit assumptions are not stated, they are implied, hence the term implicit. They are assumed by the reader to be they are assumed by the writer to be assumptions that readers will share. So implicit assumptions, as I told my students, work when the assumption is something you can reasonably believe that your audience will already accept. Explicit assumptions are directly stated premises for an argument, and those are more useful when you don't know that the reader will automatically accept this thing as true. So that's the setup. Then I gave them an argument. In this case, you should study hard to succeed in English 15. You can do a variation thereupon, especially if you don't work at Penn State and don't teach English 15. You could substitute your own course number, course designation, whatever it is. You could substitute the phrase "this class," you should study hard so you succeed in this class, or broader still, so you succeed in school. Whatever it is. But some version thereupon. That's what I used because I think this is a fairly easy one for students to understand, even though I think identifying the assumptions that underpin an argument is not itself an easy activity. So then I have them work, I let them work by themselves with a partner, small groups, whatever they prefer. That's tends to be my standard approach unless there's some reason to have individual or group work. And I basically say to them, all right, I'm going to give you a few minutes, 5 minutes, whatever it is. Try and identify as many assumptions as you can that underpin this argument, things that we would need to believe in order to be convinced by this argument. I give them the time to do it, and then I ask them what they've come up with. I put their list of assumptions up on the board. And so far, I've done this exercise 4 times with different classes. They've done pretty well. So, I mean, there's a ton of assumptions that could go into this. Things like studying is more likely to produce success. English 15 requires studying. The material of English 15 is challenging. You know what good study habits are, or what studying hard means. So these sorts of assumptions underpin the argument. If we don't make these assumptions as readers, right, the argument falls apart. So students did pretty well, in my experience, identifying some of the assumptions, at least, that underpin this argument. Then what we talked about was, I pointed out that all of the assumptions that they've identified are implicit assumptions. And so we talked about making them explicit, right? What would it look like if we took one or two or more of the assumptions that they've identified and built those directly in to the statement to make the assumptions explicit? And I modeled the first one for them. I would typically take something like, most groups said some version of English 15 is difficult. And so you can incorporate that assumption in fairly easily and rewrite the sentence. Because English 15 is difficult, you should study hard to succeed in the class. Easy and straightforward, but it gets students thinking about what elements can be built into a claim. And then I asked students, I would choose another assumption off the list that they've come up with and say, okay, who can rewrite this initial claim to incorporate this assumption? And students did pretty well with it. So again, this is a good way of sort of taking a premise, taking an argument that students will understand, right? Because they all pretty much by definition have experience of being students. And so they understand these ideas of studying, they understand the ideas of succeeding in schoolwork, whatever it is. And you use that familiar territory to sort of say, okay, let's think about how we move through arguments, how arguments are premised, basically. And so it gets students thinking about what, as critical readers, on the one hand, what does an argument require that we assume or that we believe, whatever it is, in order to convince us? But it also gets them thinking about, as a writer, what assumptions do I depend on my audience to make? And should I make some of those explicit so that I actually spend some time trying to persuade readers to believe these things? And this can definitely help strengthen students' writing if they develop a more sophisticated awareness of what they're doing as writers and how much they're counting on readers to actually fill in gaps.